Our next Open Door Champion Award recipient is Meris Bergquist. Meris works tirelessly to end housing discrimination in Western and Central Massachusetts. Last year, the Trump administration announced that it would issue a new rule repealing the Obama administration's affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. As Meris said at the time, HUD's new rule flagrantly violates the letter and spirit of the Fair Housing Act and upends decades of legal precedent. This rule is misguided and cannot stand. Meris, I want to thank you and your colleagues for your work and all the work that you do to continue to make progress and ensure that people have the opportunities to live in the communities where they want to live and have the opportunities to prosper. Please, everybody, join me in welcoming and congratulating Meris Bergquist.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. It's really a great pleasure to be with you here today, and I'm a great admirer of CHAPA, your steadfast, longstanding commitment to affordable housing, and for this excellent symposium on fair housing today. We really appreciate that. I also want to say how meaningful it is to me to be in the presence or in the company of the other awardees. Hearing from Councilwoman Edwards about her transformation of Boston's zoning regulations to embed fair housing requirements into those regulations is so inspiring. And I understand, the other awardees are also doing very innovative work. That would be Simone Crawford, who is working with very innovative strategies to promote or to decrease the racial gap in wealth accumulation through Black home ownership, which is very exciting and very needed. Also, was touched by Bill Berman's work, very much touched and moved by Bill Berman's work and the Suffolk team, who did what I think is the definitive fair housing testing investigation for race and Section 8 discrimination in the Boston rental market. We've all learned so much. It was exciting to hear from him that there are actually now legislative initiatives that are being taken as on the basis of that study. And very nice to meet Colin Killick, who is working to increase accessibility throughout Boston for people with disabilities. So I find that work incredibly inspiring, and it gives me great hope. I'm also, really happy to be here to talk about our organization's role in challenging the HUD's attempt, basically, to roll back protections under the disparate impact rule in 2020, in September 2020. If HUD had succeeded, we would have, I think, really lost the ability to protect people from a specific type of discrimination, which as I'll discuss, would have had, a really negative effect on civil rights. So disparate, I just want to begin by sort of explaining generally, sort of summarizing what the disparate impact rule is. It is really an essential element of anti-discrimination law. So it allows us to challenge policies that appear neutral on their face, but have an unjustifiably discriminatory effect on individuals in a protected category. What this all allows in some cases is for neutral policies to hide intentional and unintentional forms of bias. So I'd like to give you an example about how, a rule that we would need a disparate impact analysis to bring a case to challenge. So there are policies in effect now, across Massachusetts, across the country really, where landlords who might not want to rent to someone because they're Latino could have a policy, an admissions policy that says, we're not going to rent to someone with a criminal history. That's our policy. That policy appears neutral on its face. It's not singling out any group. But because people of color have more and frequent contacts with the criminal justice system, Black and brown people would be disproportionately affected by such a rule and denied housing opportunities on that basis. So that is kind of the theory of disparate impact. It's essential to, if we want to have robust, fair housing enforcement, we need disparate impact. So I'm going to structure my comments today by going over a brief history of the case and then talking about, again, why disparate impact was so important, and then looking at how we can use disparate impact to do something that I'm really passionate about right now, and that is to build fair housing back better at this time, at this moment in time. The history of the disparate impact case from 2020 is really a story of extraordinary teamwork. And there are many people that I would need to thank. I'm going to thank a few of them, unfortunately, leave a few out, but I do want to thank a couple of key players. So I want to first thank, honestly, my organization, Massachusetts Fair Housing Center, for stepping up and for having 100% support from our staff and our board to bring this challenge against HUD to the disparate impact rule. I also want to thank our co-plaintiff, Housing Works from New York City, because they stood with us from the beginning and also deserve credit for bringing this case. And finally, I want to thank a number of individuals in the civil rights community in Massachusetts who filed declarations in court to support our case. And among them is another one of the awardees today, Bill Berman. He gave us a statement to support our case, and we're, of course, very grateful for that. But finally, last but not least, I have to mention the stellar work of our attorneys who represented us in this case. We had superstar attorneys from Lawyers for Civil Rights, including Lauren Sampson, Oren Selstrom, and from the law firm of Krieger and Anderson, Annie Lee, Scott Lewis, and Mina Macarius. So without them, I don't think that we would have prevailed. This time, what is truly remarkable about this case, in my opinion, is the result, but also that we achieved this result within 31 days. So there was a very tricky sort of timetable that we had to adhere to if we wanted to stop the rule from going into effect. And what this timeline shows essentially is that the case, we had to wait before we could file the case until September 24th, when it was first published in the Federal Register. And so the attorneys were ready to file their complaint, as you can see on 9/28. They were able to file a motion for a nationwide preliminary injunction on October 6th. And this was all because the court had to issue its ruling within 30 days to stop the rule from ever going into effect. Because when it was published, according to a schedule that said it would not be effective for 30 days. So it would have been effective on October 26, 2020, unless the court issued a hearing on our motion for a preliminary injunction and issued its ruling to prevent nationwide implementation on October 25th, 2020. Our attorneys were, from the beginning, they were fearless, they were brilliant, they were led by Lauren Sampson and able to accomplish what I think is a really incredible feat of litigation in this 31 days. I also want to point out that there's a very high bar to obtain an order, an injunction in any case, but to get a nationwide injunction and to block a federal agency from enacting a rule is a very high bar that must be cleared to get any preliminary injunction. So I just want to thank our attorneys and point out that we would not have been able to do this case without the collaboration, without the community support that we received, brilliant attorneys who worked on the case. And also I just want to point out, we had a very good independent federal judge who took the case seriously, weighed all the evidence and issued his ruling finding essentially that that there was a likelihood that we would succeed on the merits and that HUD had acted in an arbitrary and capricious way in issuing its regulation. So again, why is disparate impact important? And so I think to simply put it, we need disparate impact because without it, it would be nearly impossible to use our legal system to challenge systemic racial discrimination and segregation, along with other forms of systemic housing discrimination. So I can't emphasize it enough. This is an absolutely essential tool that civil rights attorneys need to challenge systemic forms of injustice. And why is it important to challenge systemic segregation? So this slide depicts just some of the tremendous inequities caused by racial residential segregation. And these are segregation can be a matter of life and death. And so, in red, I've pointed out how segregation, residential racial segregation, has manifested itself during COVID-19. I think most of us know that, or have heard that communities of color are suffering higher rates of COVID-19 and higher rates of COVID-19 fatalities. And you can trace that back to location. Impacts of climate change are being felt in formerly red line neighborhoods more than in other neighborhoods. And now we see how we're struggling. We have a crisis of police violence. And we know that people who live in segregated communities are more frequently exposed to the criminal justice system. So we are, I think, in a serious crisis, not just the COVID-19 epidemic, but the epidemics of racial injustice, systemic racism. And so we're at a point in time where we are experiencing a very serious crisis. I don't have to tell, and we've talked about it earlier in the day, but we are witnessing, I think, devastating police violence, deaths, disproportionate share of deaths during COVID-19. And I believe that this is a real current crisis that must compel us to act. But it's also, it's an opportunity. We are in a moment where I believe we can build a fair housing movement to address some of these major problems and ameliorate the effects of racial residential segregation. And one of the ways that we can do that is by strengthening. I expect that HUD will be issuing a new disparate impact rule. Well, we can weigh in on that and try to get even a stronger disparate impact rule that could be even friendlier or, more easier to enforce or easier to bring cases to challenge systemic discrimination. I believe that there's also legislation proposed at the state level to enact a disparate impact rule, sort of on the same theory I think that Andrew was referencing earlier about getting a strong AFFH rule on the state level. So I think we should be concentrating on that in terms of building fair housing back better. I love the idea of replicating Boston's AFFH ordinance. People have talked about that. We should be doing that now. I work in central and western Massachusetts. We should be doing that in Worcester. We should be doing that in Springfield. It should be contagious. It should be spreading across the country to affirmatively further fair housing. And I also just want to talk about increasing funding for private fair housing organizations. So I think the Suffolk testing investigation showed that there is systemic housing discrimination based on race in Section 8, and we're not going to be able to reduce that rate of discrimination without more funding for fair housing organizations like the 4 FIP funded, I should say HUD funded fair housing organizations in Massachusetts right now, Suffolk being another one of them. So these are just some ideas. There are many other good ideas out there. So I will end by just saying that I think we're in a moment where we do need to act. We do need to act to end systemic racism. Disparate impact theories are tied into that. I hope that we can find new ways to work together and actually conquer this problem. It's not just that I think we should, I think we have to. I don't think we can move ahead as a country unless we end systemic racial discrimination.